Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And it was definitely a disappointing result for our Oakland Athletics here in 2041. The offseason is finally underway today. Our season has been over for a few weeks, and the Cross Bay rivals of Oakland, the San Francisco Giants, have been crowned as your World Series champions. We had an outstanding regular season going 108-54, the best record we've had in these now 18 seasons trying to rebuild the Oakland A's franchise. Unfortunately, as we were pursuing a repeat World Series championship, we were upended in the American League Division Series by the Chicago White Sox 3-2, which ended our season much earlier than we would have hoped. That said, we've made decent progress with these A's over these 18 seasons. Our overall budget just increased to $200 million, the first time we have reached that threshold. Unfortunately, as good as $200 million sounds, it's still the 28th highest budget in baseball out of 30 teams, so we are still not in an excellent financial situation, but fortunately on the field, things have been going better. 11 playoff appearances, including 4 world championships at this point. We've now made the playoffs 6 years in a row and 10 of the last 11 seasons. And certainly would hope and expect that this team will be back in the postseason in October of 2042. As I noted, it was an outstanding regular season for Oakland. Our 108-54 record was actually 4 worse than Pythagorean expectations. And we almost ran the table in all of the primary batting and pitching categories, something I've never done in OOTP. We were first in all of the primary pitching categories, first in the 2 key defensive categories, first in all of the primary offensive categories except for homers, where we were second, in strikeouts, where we were second, and we were even pretty good on the base paths, tied for second in steals and fourth in base running. Otherwise, we led the league in everything. So an outstanding season, but as we prepare for this upcoming offseason, it's going to be similar to where we were a year ago. Our payroll is too high for our budget at this point. You can see our scouting and player development budgets have been cut back very significantly from where they were a year ago. And our goal is to get them more in line with where they've been historically. We still have a very good farm system, which has been important to us being able to build a consistent winner here, even though we haven't been having a lot of money to spend. Although there's turnover coming this offseason, and we're certainly going to be losing some players, and we'll talk about that over the remainder of this episode as we go through our annual roster review and start putting out some initial thoughts as to who will be back and who will be moving on from. But I don't think it'll be quite as dramatic as a year ago. Last season, we lost Chase Dora, longtime number 2 starter, Mike Gallick, another capable starting pitcher. Mike Orozco had been our stopper for many years. Daniel Blanco, a very good reliever. Sergio Palomares, who came up through our farm system and played center field and other outfield spots for us for several years. Andy Toribio, longtime shortstop, and most significantly, Jake, the franchise Ortega, a player we picked in the first round many years ago, played a decade in Oakland before he got too expensive for us. And despite all that turnover last offseason, we moved from 106 wins to 108 wins. I think with the anticipated turnover that we have coming this offseason, another 2-game improvement to 110 wins is probably unlikely. But I do think that even with the moves we'll have to make to get our payroll back in order, we can probably keep this team very competitive and at least try to win a 5th consecutive AL West title and hopefully get ourselves a first-round bye in the playoffs. And I mentioned that our pitching was outstanding this season, and we'll start off talking about our healthy players. We put up this outstanding season with some pretty significant injuries, but for the time being, we'll review the guys who were healthy as the season came to an end. Former second-round pick Federico Arriola, poised to get some support for a Cy Young Award this year. At the age of 24, he was an all-star for the first time, led the American League with 19 wins, a 19-7 record, a league-best 2.41 ERA, and a league-best 0.93 WHIP. His 5.9 WAR, I believe, is fourth in the league, so it's conceivable that he won't win the Cy Young Award. But certainly if you lead the league in wins, ERA, and WHIP, while also striking out close to 200 batters and having a WAR of close to 6, likely to see some pretty significant support for him in the Cy Young Award voting. Going to still be making the major league minimum a year ago. He's a guy we'd like to lock up for the future, but he's looking for a ton of money right now, so at this point we're going to let him play through his minimum salary years and his upcoming arbitration years. Another guy that we've had to treat similarly is Doug Weiss, former fourth-round pick out of Austin Peay. He led the league in wins a year ago. Had some injury issues this year, but was still 10-2 with a 3.61 ERA and more than a strikeout per inning. Put up a WAR of 2.4 for us. He's headed into his final arbitration-eligible season. Given that he's going to be 30 years old before next year, and he's fragile physically, and we did note those injury issues he had this year. And most importantly, he's looking for a ton of money. He's a guy who we likely let play out his final arbitration-eligible season this year. The lefty Mike Blumenschein, who we picked in the first round out of Brown several years ago, relatively healthy for a second straight year, a 15-3 record with a 2.58 ERA, a 3 WAR. The best season of his career, definitely more of a third or fourth starter. But he is a guy who we did get signed to a longer-term deal. And fortunately for us, it was a deal that he was willing to front load. So he is going to hopefully become very good value for us in the late 20s and early 30s of his career, even though we probably were overpaying him when he was younger. I mentioned that we traded away Mike Gallick last offseason when we needed to purge some payroll. We did bring him back right before the trade deadline in a transaction with the Padres, and he was excellent for us, 9-3 record, 3.30 ERA. The fan favorite, set to make about $11 million in what I believe will be his final arbitration eligible next season next year. Still haven't decided for sure whether he's going to be back with us at that price tag. Definitely prefer Weiss over Gallick if we're going to be spending $10 to $15 million on one guy next year. But it's conceivable that we will try to bring Gallick back next year, given that we do have some pretty significant injuries in our potential starting rotation for the start of next year. And last, and unfortunately based on his performance last season least, Dave Baumler, number 5 starter, struggled with a 6-9 record and an ERA of close to 5, was still above replacement level, and he still happens to be the only captain personality that we have on the team right now. He is finally arbitration eligible, but the $1.8 million for next year is not a big figure. So unless we're able to find another captain personality to keep our clubhouse humming along effectively and peacefully, pretty conceivable that Baumler may be back in that 5-hole in the starting rotation next season. And 2 other very important pitchers who we hope will be in the mix again next season, spent good chunks of this year on the injured list. Unfortunately, unlike some of the guys that we just talked about, notably Areola and Weiss, we have signed both of these guys to long-term contracts, and they're both coming off of pretty significant injuries. So our hope is when we get to next season, they'll kind of be what they've always been after hopefully some effective rehabilitation. Ernesto Comunez suffered a torn labrum in mid-June, missed the rest of the season. The 23-year-old is fragile physically, was 5-3 with a 3.38 ERA this year, 1.6 WAR in the limited action that he did have. Would certainly expect that if he does recover from that torn labrum over the next 3 to 4 weeks, that he should be healthy and well come spring training and competing with the guys that we just mentioned for a spot in the rotation next year. Situation with our number one starter, Jesus Saldana, a little more dicey. He suffered a torn UCL at the end of March and is still expected to miss another 7 months. So he's going to miss all of the offseason and miss spring training. Best case scenario is maybe we get him into a rehab assignment sometime in mid to late May of next year. So we could have him up in the majors by June. He was 7-2 with a 3.39 ERA, but only pitched 11 games for us, and certainly losing the guy who had been our number one starter did not help our chances in the playoffs. He is a guy who we've signed to a long-term deal when he was young, 10 years, $70 million. Unfortunately, it's not a front-loaded contract, so he's going to be getting more expensive over these next few years as he heads into his late 20s and early 30s. But if he comes out of his rehab looking pretty much like the guy that he's always been, still could be an important pitcher for us going forward. But as you can see in some of the recent scouting reports since he suffered his injury, we don't think he's exactly what he was before. But we'll certainly know more when he can actually get back onto the mound. So with the guys who are healthy and the guys who are injured, certainly feel like we should have a very good starting rotation again next season. We did rent Juan Padilla as our closer this year. Picked him up from Texas in mid-July. And he did a nice job for us with a 2.57 ERA and 15 saves over the last 2.5 months of the season. Unfortunately, Mr. Padilla is looking for 5 years at $26 million a year in his early to mid-30s to be a closer. And that is certainly not a number that we are going to be able to touch. So he will almost certainly be moving on from us. Guy who we may have take over as our closer next year is Joe Heilman, former 5th-round pick out of Cleburne County High School in Georgia. Number 39 prospect in baseball now, split the year between AAA and the majors. Had a 2.97 ERA in the majors over 72 2/3 innings pitched. Almost 10 strikeouts per 9 innings. Throws in the triple digits. World-class fastball and a splitter that is headed in that direction. Only criticism for him this season is that he did give up 11 home runs in just 72 2/3 innings pitched. But you look at his home run allowed and movement ratings and tend to think that was probably bad luck. Did certainly have some good luck too, though. His allowed a BABIP of only 215, which you think would probably trend higher next year. But assuming we move on from Padilla, Heilman could be in the mix to be our closer next season. Left-handed pitcher Jake Mendick, a guy we traded for from Arizona a couple of years ago, had a solid season for us, a 3.71 ERA, pitched 68 innings out of the pen, had a WAR of almost a win above replacement. Really nice profile, good in the clubhouse, and he is a lefty. Still relatively young. He's going to turn 28 in about a month. But he is wrecked physically at this point, and he's also likely to be making around $5 million when we hopefully settle his arbitration case if we bring him back. So Mendick, given the money he's looking for and the fact that he is injury prone, is certainly a guy who I think could be on the chopping block over the coming days if we can get something interesting for him in return in a trade. Maybe package him and another guy who might be a little more expensive and not in our long-term future and try to bring a decent prospect back. Similar to the trades we made last offseason, most notably moving on from Orozco and Blanco, the experienced and accomplished pitchers, for Luis Villarreal, who's one of the better prospects in our organization now. One pitcher that I do expect to be back is Jonathan Scherer, 27-year-old right-hander. Put up a 3.18 ERA over 79 and a third innings pitched. And he's a guy who's now spent part of the last 5 seasons in the majors with Oakland. Basically been a full-time major leaguer for the last 3 years. Has an ERA of about 3 over the course of his career. And with an arbitration number of $3 million next year for a very good major league reliever with an outstanding fastball and slider, would certainly expect Scherer to be back with us next year. Lefty Wilson Rangel, number 25 prospect in baseball, still making the major league minimum. Made his major league debut for us this year. Wasn't perfect with a 4.36 ERA over 53 and 2/3 innings. His whip of 1.38 and a BABIP against him of almost 400. Certainly not what we're looking for. But he did have a ridiculous 73 strikeouts in 53 and 2/3 innings and an outstanding 6.6 strikeout to walk ratio. So certainly see a bigger role for Rangel in the bullpen next year. Kevin Carmichael also likely to be back. He's arbitration eligible, looking to make $3.5–4 million. But he had a solid year for us. He ended up starting 10 games when we had some of the significant pitching injuries before we reunited with Mr. Gallick. 5-3 record, 4 saves, an ERA of just over 4, a win above replacement. Still popular with the fans, and is a guy who, as I talked about earlier, can both start and relieve. Does have kind of a 3.5 pitch arsenal and just enough stamina to give us 5 innings most occasions when he's starting. Lefty. So I tend to think Carmichael will be back. And another lefty who should be back with us next year, Luis Aguayo, former 14th round pick, who is turned into a pretty good looking prospect. 3.23 ERA over 47 1/3 innings for us this year. 10.3 strikeouts per 9. And think as a guy who's making the major league minimum, he should definitely be back with us next year. I mentioned that we could move on from the lefty Mendick, having Rangel, Carmichael, and Aguayo all potentially as lefties in the bullpen. Makes that a realistic plan. And because of that, it's conceivable that we will be moving on from another lefty, Chuck Huntley, our former closer. Fell out of that role this year when we made the big trade to bring on a more experienced closer, and he actually ended up not even being on our postseason roster. Had a 5.40 ERA over 55 innings this year, almost a win below replacement level. And he's a guy who's set to be making over $7 million next year. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, his velocity over the last less than 2 years has moved from triple digits to the low 90s. And his stuff and his movement, not what they used to be. You can see used to look and certainly even perform as one of the top closers in baseball. Saved 33 or more games for us 3 straight years before this season. And we thought he might be a guy that we could build around for the future. But with the decline in his velocity and the decline in his overall ratings, and the fact that we do have youngsters like Aguayo and Rangel as lefties out of the pen coming up through the organization. Moving on from Huntley and Mendick are moves that could save us around $12 million next year and potentially bring us some interesting prospects in return, although I don't think the demand for the likes of Mendick and Huntley is going to be quite what we saw for guys like Gallick, Orozco, and Blanco last offseason. Another couple pitchers to talk about, and both of these guys may not be part of our future as they will be officially out of options at this point. Nelson Delgado, 27-year-old, former 17th round pick, made his major league debut for us this year with a 4.37 ERA over 22 2/3 innings. Looks like a useful back of the rotation, or not really back of the rotation, although we did have him start one game for us this year. But with his two-pitch arsenal, more of a high-volume, long or middle reliever. But given that he's fragile, he's going to be 28 before next season, and we're going to not be able to stash him in the minors anymore since he's now out of options. His spot on the 40-man roster could be in jeopardy. Similarly, Danny Dakar, a first-round pick of ours in 2034, did make his major league debut at the end of this season with a 4.85 ERA over just 13 innings, called up in September. He's won 12 games in AAA each of the last couple years. He looks like he can be a good, solid fifth starter in the majors, but he's also fragile physically, and another guy, as I noted, who is out of option years at this point. So seems very conceivable that we would move on from Mr. Dakar this offseason as well. And two final pitchers who should be in the mix for spots in the bullpen next year that I haven't mentioned yet. Eric Keach, who was an all-star this year as a rookie, did end up injured at the end of the season, so he missed the playoffs. But he put up a 2.82 ERA in 51 games for us this year. A WAR of 1 win above replacement. Outstanding fastball to go with a good changeup, and think that he should be a cheap, ineffective right-handed reliever for us going forward. So although he wasn't on the 30-man roster as of the end of the regular season or the postseason roster, he is healthy now and certainly would expect him to have a prominent role in our bullpen next year. And another guy who suffered a more significant injury than Keach is Chad Evans, 25-year-old former second-round pick. Been out since late July with shoulder inflammation. Our hope is he'll be back by spring training. Split the year between AAA Las Vegas and Oakland. Put up a 5.40 ERA over 26 2/3 innings in Oakland. But he is a reliever with a potential 4-pitch arsenal, and given that he's got that 35 stamina, we have used him as a starter at times in the minors and certainly could be a spot starter for us in the majors. The hope is he'll come back with that from that shoulder inflammation healthy, and still holding out some hope that the number 40 prospect in baseball and Mr. Evans will be an important member of our pitching staff next year. So long story short, with some of the depth that we do have in the organization, and with the guys like Evans, Saldana, Camunez, and even Keach recovering from injuries and potentially coming back, I think we can afford to move on from both Mendick and Huntley to save some money. Big question to me is, do we bring Gallick back next year? If Saldana, Camunez, and Evans are all healthy and well, he's a bit of a luxury. But as we saw this season, we do have the potential for injuries with the pitching staff like all teams. And picking up Gallic to help us down the stretch certainly helped this year. And with Saldana certainly looking like he's going to be out for the first couple months of next season, and a possibility that Evans might not be ready either, I tend to think I'm leaning towards bringing Gallic back at around $11 million for next year to hopefully ensure that we've got a big-time starting rotation once again. Moving on to our position players, and we've got a very strong roster here. But similar to our pitching, we're going to have some big decisions to make this offseason. The most significant is certainly our all-star catcher, Jorge Mendoza. We picked him up 3.5 years ago in a big trade with the Twins, and he's been everything we could have hoped. Put up a 131 WRC plus and a 6 WAR for us this year during the regular season. Very good defensive catcher with a very good bat. 25 doubles, 16 homers, 15 steals. Left-handed hitter. But he is going to be 30 next year, and most importantly, he's headed to free agency, and he's still looking at over $30 million a year for the next 9 years. So given the financial situation that we are in, I think we're going to just have to make him a qualifying offer and wish him the best wherever he does end up signing. He is an extremely popular player, so we'll certainly take a hit to fan interest when he leaves. But just don't see any practical way that we can keep Mendoza around for next year. But feel like we got his best years out of him in his late 20s. Member of a couple of World Series championship teams here with Oakland. And a year ago, he was both the ALCS and the World Series MVP. His backup this year and the last couple of years has been Hidetaka Ogata. But with the youngster who can also play catcher, Jonah Richards, on the lineup this year, Ogata started only 7 games and only had 34 at-bats. Hit just a $147. He is an outstanding defensive catcher, world-class at blocking and pretty much world-class in terms of his framing. Arm that's slightly above average. But the bat is certainly not impressive. As much as we love his glove, now that he's no longer making the major league minimum and he's headed to arbitration for the first time, I don't think there's a guarantee that he's back with us if we can find a guy making the minimum who's also a good defensive catcher. We're probably not going to get someone quite as good defensively as Ogata, but if we can get a solid defensive catcher with a bat that we think is a little bit better for the major league minimum, we could have a complete turnover in our catcher room for the 2042 season. One player that will definitely be back is the young first baseman Luis Godina, IAFA signing from 2033. And he followed up a very good rookie season in 2040 with one of the best seasons in baseball this year. Led the American League in at-bats with 662, runs with 127, and also with 8 triples, 31 doubles, 43 homers, 118 ribbies, 12 stolen bases, hit almost 300, added up to a 148 WRC plus and a 5.1 WAR. Played primarily first base for us this year at 6'3", with the strong infield ratings that he has. He is a potential Gold Glove Award winning first baseman. You can see his zone rating above average and his defensive efficiency at first a little bit above average. And he's also capable of playing second, third, short, and even spent a little time in left field and right field for us this year. So an incredibly valuable player for us, still going to be making the major league minimum next year. He's a guy that we could have signed last offseason. Felt like between him and Jonah Richards, we could only sign one of those players to a long-term extension. with what Godina is looking for now after this monster season. 10 years at around $30 million a season, or I guess $30 million would be his peak value. It looks like 10 years for $243 million total. So we could have signed him for about $100 million less last offseason, but given that we know we're going to have financial issues 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the line, we made the decision to sign Richards rather than Godina. So likely we'll be playing out the string with Godina over the next 4 seasons, making the major league minimum this upcoming year, and then he'll get into 3 arbitration seasons, and we'll try to extract as much value as we can from him before we likely let him hit free agency 4 years from now. Chris Lance, left-handed hitting infielder, picked him up in a trade with Atlanta just about a year ago. Had a really big year for us in AAA and did hit over 422 major league at-bats. Could be in a first base DH role for us next year. And the reason why I say that is a guy who, along with Godina, was in a first base DH role for us this year, Jonah Richards, is likely to pivot to become our starting catcher. The left-handed hitter is the number 1 prospect in baseball. He was the American League Rookie of the Month 4 out of the 6 months this season and ended up hitting .285, 38 homers, 114 ribbies, 4.4 WAR on the season. Played primarily DH and first base for us this year because we did have both Mendoza and Ogata in the mix at catcher. But Richards is defensively probably just as good as Mendoza was, and think he likely has a better bat with outstanding home run power and a great eye. So looking forward to turn over the catcher position to Jonah Richards next season. And as I noted, that could open up a little more playing time for Lance at first base or DH along with Godina. Some other interesting decisions in the infield. I'll talk about the 3 guys who will almost certainly be back before I talk to the decisions that we have to make. Chisa Iwata, the second baseman who we signed out of Japan a couple years ago, missed about a month this year with injuries. Not quite as productive as during his rookie season, but still put up a 115 WRC plus, 3.6 WAR, stole 19 bases, hit 13 homers. Pretty productive season, good defensively, good speed, good hitter, good in the clubhouse. And he was a slightly front-loaded contract, so he'll be making a little bit less next year, which will help relieve a tiny bit of stress off of our payroll. Phil Swenson, who we picked up in a trade with Minnesota about a year ago, spent most of the season in AAA, but did hit .250 and 128 major league at-bats, was basically a league average offensive player, about half a win above replacement. Another guy who's versatile and good defensively, good speed, and we think a respectable-looking major league bat. He should certainly be a utility infielder for us next year, and depending on what we do, he could be competing for a starting spot. Juan Pimentel, off to a brilliant start in his career, was Rookie of the Year 2 years ago, MVP last season. I guess it's technically an off year for him this year, but he still went out and hit .280, 98 runs scored, 27 homers, 102 ribbies, stole 22 bases, put up a 115 WRC plus and a 4.7 WAR. But that is the lowest WAR of his 3-year career. Looking at his profile, though, another good and versatile infielder, another infielder with really good speed, and of the guys that we've talked about recently who will definitely be back with us next year, Iwata, Swenson, and Pimentel. Pimentel certainly has the best bat and is also durable as far as his injury proneness. So with possibly Godina and Lance at first base and DH, Iwata likely at second, but could pivot to a different position. Pimentel at third, but could pivot to a different position. and Swenson likely a utility infielder, but could pivot to become a starter. That explains why the futures of these next two players are in a bit more doubt for us. Amari Alcindor is a guy we signed to an extension, 10 years, $64 million, when he had very limited major league experience. Unfortunately, he's a guy who hasn't really lived up to what we thought he might become. Spent this entire season as a utility infielder for us, which he's basically done for the past 3 years. He was kind of a starter for us when he first came up in 2038, but the last few years been more of a utility guy. Hit 266, put up a 104 WRC plus and a 1 WAR. I think in a perfect world, we'd love to have him back as a utility infielder. One of the better defensive infielders that we have. Very versatile, similar to a lot of the other guys we've talked about, and a decent bat. The issue with Alcindor is that 5 years from now, he's going to be making $9-10 million a season. And unless he truly becomes a starter at some point, he's likely to price himself off of the team. Next year, though, at $5 million, tend to think we will probably have either him or this other player that we're going to talk about right now back, but probably not both of them. Alejandro Landin, former IAFA signing from 14 plus years ago, has had an outstanding career with us here in Oakland. But the bat is definitely trending in the wrong direction. Over the last 3 years, he's gone from leading the league with 40 homers and a 149 WRC plus to 22 homers and a 136 WRC plus to 16 homers this year with a 98 WRC plus. You can see he's gone from being a MVP contender with a 6.6 WAR down to a 1.1 WAR for us this year. Still was our starting shortstop for most of the year. Another guy who is strong and versatile defensively. A fan favorite. But the bat is definitely regressing more towards a average-ish major league bat, which is what we saw on the field this year in terms of his production. He is at 31, one of the older players on our roster, and he's fragile physically. We've got a team option for $5 million for him for next year. I think that Flea Landin on paper is probably our best defensive shortstop. But when we look at the fielding statistics this year, his zone rating and defensive efficiency at shortstop were both well below average. So with that $5 million option, I think it's not inconceivable that we move on from Landin, which would necessitate probably having an Iwata, a Swenson, or an Alcindor if we kept him around as our starting shortstop next year. We probably lose a little bit defensively on paper if we move on from Landin. I think a lot of it will depend on what type of trade value Landin and Alcindor have. If one of them has significantly more trade value than the other, I'd probably be inclined to move on from that player. My hunch is that since Landin's in the last year of his contract, and as I talked about, Alcindor's contract could get not crippling for any team, even a team like Oakland, but certainly questionable in terms of his value. And there are still several years of guaranteed commitment. It's not going to shock me if there's a little bit more interest in Landin. And if that's the case, it's conceivable that a year after we moved from our long-term shortstop and partner in crime in the middle of the infield with Landin and Andy Toribio, that we could be moving on from Landin this offseason, who took over as our shortstop from Toribio a couple of years ago. But feeling like if we headed into next year with Godina at first, let's say Alcindor at second, Iwata at short, Pimentel at third, and then Swenson as a middle infield utility guy. Lance is more of a corner infield DH utility guy. Even if we do move on from Landine, feel like our infield is probably in pretty good shape for next season. So when we think about the infielders and the catchers, it's conceivable that even if we move on from a player or two, and even if we move on from the great Mendoza, that our only real question among catchers and infielders is, do we bring Ogata back as our backup catcher or try to find a more cost-effective alternative? And I think we're probably in a pretty similar space with our outfield, where I don't see a lot of turnover coming. Darnell Selvey, former first-round pick, had another monster season for us. 306 batting average, 32 homers, 104 ribbies. Put up a 154 WRC plus and a 5.9 WAR. Selvey headed to arbitration for the first time, set to make around $5.5 million. He is another guy who is looking for big money. Can't show you here since we've already made an arbitration offer to him, but tend to think similar to the way that we were talking about Godina. Selvey is a guy, given our financial limitations, that we probably just end up letting play through his minimum salary years, which are now complete, and his arbitration years, which will be beginning next season. Jesus Aguiar, former IAFA signing, hit 264 for us in 220 at-bats this year, was a perfect 10 for 10 stealing bases, a bit below average offensively, but did put up a 1.5 WAR for us. Really good defensive outfielder, really good speed. The bat, not all that exciting, but he is a left-hander, and think he could be an outstanding fourth outfielder for us, making the major league minimum these next few years. We're hoping that Bobby Armstrong, who we traded for a year ago, and we signed him to a pretty significant and front-loaded contract a few months ago, continues to develop into a better-than-average major leaguer. Hit 268 for us in 440 at-bats. Did have 26 doubles and 4 triples, only 9 homers. We hope that he can have a little more pop in the bat going forward. Did steal 36 bases in 40 attempts. Was basically a league average offensive player. Put up a 3.3 WAR for us overall, boosted by his defense and speed. He certainly, at least for the near term, is our likely starting center fielder. And we do like the fact that with Aguiar, we've got a guy who's a left-handed hitter with a better glove who can give us some help defensively in the late innings and perhaps pinch hit on occasion for Armstrong against tough right-handed pitchers. The guy whose spot could be in jeopardy is Joe Harmon, former second-round pick. Hit 288 for us in 163 at-bats this year. Another guy who was very efficient on the base paths, 10 for 10 stealing bases. Average offensive player, put up a 1 WAR. Another guy who's got a combination of a good glove, good speed, good in the clubhouse, with a respectable bat. He is, however, fragile physically and out of option years, but he is still set to make the major league minimum next year. I think if we were going to move on from an outfielder, Harmon is the most likely candidate, given that he is another right-handed hitting bat, and we're probably a little bit light on left-handed hitters for our lineup next year. We do have some youngsters in AA and AAA knocking on the door to potentially help us in the outfield, and perhaps it'll be time to move on from Harmon this offseason. If not, I would think next year, when he'll be headed into his arbitration years, would probably be the latest period at which Harmon would still be on this roster, and would think if he does play with us this year, this is most likely his final year in Oakland. And right fielder Arturo Uresti always seems to get off to relatively slow starts, but also always seems to put up some pretty decent numbers when all is said and done. And he did so again this year, although the batting average was only .241. Scored almost 100 runs, drove in over 100 runs, 30 home runs, 84 walks, put up a 116 WRC plus and a 4.3 WAR. He was a Gold Glove right fielder a year ago, and certainly coming off of a season with a 7.4 zone rating, 1.067 defensive efficiency, and a good arm. Probably going to get some attention to win another Gold Glove this season. Good, solid major league bat. Signed to a decent contract for the next few years. Starting to get expensive as he gets into his late 20s and early 30s. But certainly if he continues to put up 4 to 5 WAR seasons, is pretty solid value for our team to have in the lineup. So I don't necessarily think there's going to be a ton of turnover with our everyday players as well, as talked about with the pitching staff and potentially moving on from Huntley and Mendick and maybe Gallick. Kind of a few moves possible with the position players as well. We'll be moving on from Mendoza, likely moving on from Alcindor or Landine, but probably not both of them. And then, as we talked about, there's certainly scenarios where Harmon and Ogata's spots are in jeopardy. But since they're both backups for us, I think potentially getting younger and cheaper in those spots is not necessarily a bad thing. But as we think about this roster heading into the offseason, there's going to be a fair amount of turnover from some big players as we experienced a year ago. But similar to what we experienced a year ago, I think there's enough quality and enough depth in this organization that we can lose to free agency in the case of Mendoza, and potentially in the case of trades with several of those other players we talked about. Some pretty significant contributors to our roster, and still hopefully remain a playoff team and one of the better teams in baseball in 2042. And before we finish up this episode, we'll check in on a few of the former players that we moved on from last offseason. We're going to save the big guns, Jake Ortega and Chase Dora, for our next episode when we review our farm system and review some of our real top-end former players. But as I mentioned, we moved on from a lot of guys last offseason, and always interesting to see what they ended up doing. Mike Orozco, our longtime stopper, we traded to the Twins along with Blanco in that deal that brought us Luis Villarreal. Put up a 2.1 WAR for Minnesota this year. He became their closer with 37 saves, 3.84 ERA, and a 2.91 BABIP, but he did strike out 11.5 batters per 9 innings. Good productive year for Orozco. Wrecked physically at this point, though, and now in his 30s. And he is headed to free agency potentially. So think that was probably a good trade for us to move on from Pinky. And actually, I was misspeaking, although Blanco was involved in a trade and we moved on from him last offseason. He was not part of that trade with Orozco. I guess it was Gallick, I think, who might have been with Orozco in that deal. But we'll look at that more closely next episode when we visit our top prospects, including Luis Villarreal. But Blanco with the Padres this year, very effective, 2.25 ERA over 60 innings pitched, 1.3 WAR. But we've talked a lot at the early part of this episode about the depth in our bullpen, and a right-handed reliever making $5 million was a guy that we felt we could move on from, despite the fact that we really do like Daniel Blanco, and he continues to have success with the Padres. Blanco, though, Oh, it was Blanco in Gallic for Luis Villarreal. So I've been lying to you when I said that Orozco was part of that trade. So Blanco did get, along with Gallic, Luis Villarreal for us, and think that was definitely a good investment for our organization for the longer term. Mentioned that we also traded away our longtime infielder Andy Toribio a year ago to the Braves. He hit just .214 in 543 at-bats, did resume being an everyday player, but put up just a 77 WRC+. That said, still hit a 2.5 WAR as he's got good speed and he's good defensively. Stole 59 bases for the Braves and is still a very versatile and high-quality infielder who's also developed that captain personality. And last but not least, the center fielder Sergio Gravedigger Palomares, traded him to Baltimore last offseason. Another guy set to make over $5 million as he moved into his arbitration years, given that we saw him as a, at best, platoon center fielder for us and maybe more of a bench guy. Weren't willing to spend that kind of money on him. Similar to what Atlanta did with Toribio, Baltimore really unleashed Palomares on the base paths, and he stole 58 bases for Baltimore this year after only 39 for us a year ago, although he played less for us. But the batting average was just .210, and when all was said and done, he put up only 60 WRC+, and was not even a win above replacement level. So the speed remains excellent, but the bat is just not what we hoped Palomares was going to be when we signed him as an international amateur free agent many years ago. And with that, we'll officially call it an episode. Our annual roster review and initial planning for the offseason is done at this point. As I mentioned, next time around, we're going to check in on Villarreal and some of the other top prospects in our organization. We'll also check in on some former players on our team, most notably Jake the Franchise Ortega and Chase Dora, and see what they did with their new teams this past season. And also check in on some former top prospects who we did not select in the draft or international amateur free agency, and see how they did in 2041 as well. And after that, it'll be time for the offseason to truly get underway. So if you have any thoughts on what you would do with some of the roster questions I've brought up, always helpful to hear about those in the comments. And until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.